Hello and welcome. My name is Asaf, and I'm here with pianist, composer, and professor of music in Harvard University, Mr. Vijay Iyer. It's a real honor for me to have you, Vijay, on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Vijay, I wanted to start with some of your past, your beginnings as a musician. I know that has been covered in a lot of interviews around online, but specifically speaking about the South Indian rhythmic tradition and also the North Indian tradition of rhythm. How did you come to meet those traditions, and how did you come to be influenced by those?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I have been asked a lot about my origins in the past, but not much about this, actually. Um, my parents were immigrants from India. Neither of them is a musician or anything. They came to the US in the mid 60s and were among the first major wave of immigrants from outside the West, really, into the US. That had to do with various legal systems changing around that time. The Immigration Act of 1965 is what people point to as like the main kind of shift that brought in. Basically, U.S. immigration law used to be racist, and still sort of is, but in the mid 60s, they started to open the door to more non-Western immigrants, and particularly at the time because it was the Cold War and the space race and all this stuff. They wanted scientific and technically trained Indians and other ethnicities, Nigerians and so forth. So my father came to get a PhD in pharmaceutical chemistry. He came actually a couple of years before that law, but it was part of the same kind of wave. And so that meant that people like me were among the first non-Western, or basically the first Americans, the first wave of Americans born with non-Western roots in the 20th century. And that's like, of course, excluding the legacy of enslavement, right? Because we have this huge population of people who are descended from enslaved people, right? And we also have indigenous folks. So that but this is about like America in the 20th century kind of reinventing itself. So that meant that we were initially like kind of sparse. There weren't many of us around. I often tell the story of how like my parents, when they'd see an Indian name in the phone book, they would just call them out of the blue and say, "Who are you? You want to get together?" So that was sort of how community incrementally started being built out of people who were very disparate and scarce. And so what that meant is that my exposure to so-called Indian traditions or anything like that was a little haphazard. This is no fault of my parents. They were just trying to adapt and survive and that kind of thing. But, and so I guess what I found is that some families were more tradition focused than others. And my family in particular wasn't that tradition focused. So I wasn't like constantly exposed to Indian music and Hinduism and stuff like that. It was more, it would sort of sometimes show up in the background, or when we would gather with other Indian families, then I might be exposed to some of it. Sometimes the families would pool their resources and host an Indian, like a Carnatic or Hindustani artist to perform in the community. And I was growing up in Rochester, New York. So I would sort of hear bits of it here and there. There was also like religious singing, like people singing bhajans and things like that. So that was in the air. It wasn't like I had a steady diet of it, and I also was not trained in Indian music at all. Ever.
Yeah.
So, but I also wasn't trained on the piano. So I guess I make things work somehow eventually. It takes a long time and a lot of like stubbornness and persistence and patience. But anyway, like I do remember seeing a Carnatic concert when I was a kid, like probably 7 or 8 or something, and being pretty dazzled specifically by what the percussionists were doing. And I didn't really know what they were doing. I didn't know how to parse any of it. No one had really told me what was going on. So that feeling stuck with me, particularly the feeling of like everything changing all of a sudden, like the whole, you might think you're in one kind of flow of pulse and then everything sort of like shifting in this dazzling way that I didn't understand, or I just remember the feeling in my body more than anything. And I'm pretty sure that the person who was playing in that concert, who was playing percussion, was Trichy Shankaran.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
and this is significant because then later he plays a role. And, so then, like, when I was I found my way to the piano and different things. I started playing piano by ear. I also was taking classical violin lessons. And those were the two sort of musical strains that were in my life throughout my childhood. And then in high school, I was in a rock band, and then I joined the high school jazz ensemble, and then I started getting into that whole area of music making more earnestly, the African-American creative tradition, if that's the word for it. I mean, it's like, it's got a history, it's got a present, and it's got a future. So I think when we say tradition, we treat it as though it's stuck in the past. But the thing is, it's alive and constantly changing. And that's sort of the important thing about it. And it's also true about Indian music, which is kind of like something I had to learn or come to terms with as an adult, I'd say. So when I was in my early 20s, I was finally, I went through these other paths. Like I thought I was going to be in the sciences. I did an undergraduate degree in physics and math. And then that was at Yale, and then I moved to California initially to get a doctorate in physics, and then pretty soon I realized that wasn't where my heart was, or that wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't that shouldn't be my main thrust. And around that time, though, I started like I think this was me out in the world in a way that I never had been before. So I was able to, I moved there when I was 20, and I was able to just like roam around and check stuff out on my own, in a way that, I had been doing that when I was in college too. I would come down to New York City and check out music, a lot of things. But when I was in California and I had a car and like started just going, something interesting was happening, I'd just say, well, I'm going to that. So, and it was music across the whole global spectrum of, all kinds of genres and whatever. But in particular, I sort of wanted to get into this music of my own heritage and try to come to terms with it in a way that I never really had as a child. So, I was living in Oakland, California, and then south of San Francisco is what's called Silicon Valley, and there are a lot of Indian families there. So they actually had that whole community. It was like hundreds of South Indian families, meaning like Tamil, Telugu, those kinds of families. They actually were able to host a series of Carnatic music, and they'd like rent out a high school auditorium, and so every couple of weeks there'd be somebody, Sudha Raghunathan or Shashank on flute. He was a little kid back then, or Bombay Jayashree, or all kinds of folks. Geeta Bennett, I remember. Yeah, lots of people.
Yeah.
A lot of young, like kind of up and coming Carnatic musicians, a lot of elder masters too. Lalgudi Jayaraman, I saw him. I saw his daughters. law, you know. So basically getting to do this like 2 or 3 times a month. And also like not just in a vacuum, but in the context of an auditorium full of Indian families.
And
Of
food and
particular,
everything else.
yeah. So like, so that, I mean, that was like, that reminded me of, I mean, I felt very much at home in that world, but I also was humbled by it because like I'd never um, been exposed to the music on that level at that, in that way. You know, I'd heard it, like I said, here and there, kind of piecemeal, without any kind of analytical framework for it, or even traditional sort of like. I think the most I heard it was at my cousin's Bharatanatyam recitals and things like that. So, so I was exposed to it through dance, and sometimes like friends of ours would be listening to it or have it on in the background, or at ceremonies like at a wedding or something. You'd hear Nagaswaram.
And a tawil, yes.
Yes, exactly. So I was just like starting to get into all that stuff and like become awake to it in a way that I hadn't. This is now in my 20, like 22, 23, 24. So like, you know, sitting in a community where for at a concert, a kacheri, you know, you start to learn, you just start to absorb a lot of things. I mean, I remember like I wouldn't know what was going on, and then I'd look next to me, and the 6-year-old kid is like keeping the tala, you know, like this kind of stuff. So, so that was like, oh, I guess there's this whole way of being with this music, you know, not just, and like also what, you know, like hearing people respond to things, and you know the oohs and ahs and the clucking their tongue and this kind of stuff. And you sort of got like, you kind of start to tap into what is the soul of the music, you know, which is more than, of course, like me being the kind of musicianly person I was at the time, when I was just like shifting into like, oh, I guess I'm a music person now. I'm not a science person. Let me figure out how and why and who I want to be as an artist, you know. So I was like kind of in, often I found myself sort of in analytical mode, like particularly with regard to rhythm. I mean, that stuff, like the stuff I mentioned from my childhood, like that moment of like being dazzled and kind of shaken by these like complicated shifts in rhythm. You know, I started to geek out on that stuff. Like I was consuming it. Like this is it. This is why I'm here. You know. But then there would also be these other kind of, you know, there was like an emotional quality to it. There's a spiritual quality to it. It's like devotional music. You know, it's. So I tried to take it all in ways, and realized that actually, yeah, there's the rhythmic stuff which I'm very interested in and want to kind of internalize, but I also don't want to get my priorities out of order, you know, in the sense of like what makes music work, what makes it connect to people, you know. So I guess like I was trying to find that balance for myself too. And of course, at the time, I was also checking out a lot of other things. I was studying West African drumming at the same time, and that's important.
It was quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, and particularly, it's important. It was important for me to try to harmonize those two pretty different perspectives on rhythm and pulse, and polyrhythm and so-called complexity, or whatever you want to call it. Polyphony, I guess I would say, and or the lack thereof.
Polyphony and
So,
rhythm, yes. Yeah.
yeah. So, you know, I was studying West African drumming with this guy from Ghana, and CK Ladzekbo, and so like internalizing polyrhythm and cycles, and the sort of the ritual quality of that, and also playing for dancers, because we would then like play for the dance class. So then we had to really like commit. You know, you couldn't just, it wasn't just like things to keep track of in your head. It was like you're serving the music, and you're serving a larger purpose. You're serving people's actions, you know. So so all that, and then also I got to know some Afro-Cuban musicians. Also around this time, I started working with Steve Coleman, and that was a whole other. I mean, you know, it all connected, right? Like these particular kinds of structural approaches, to attending to different systems of rhythm, systems of pulse, systems of groove, and ways of composing with rhythm. It all kind of became this thick stew for me, you know. It was very important to me. Also in the mid-90s, I met Rudresh Mohantapa, who you should also have him on the show at some point.
Definitely, yeah.
And we realized we were kind of in the same boat, in the sense that we were now coming of age as among the first South Asian Americans to be born in the US, you know. And what would it mean for us to become artists? You know, there weren't any yet at the time. There were none. There was nobody like us who was like out in the world as an artist, you know. So was there a place for us? Was the world going to embrace it or resist it? Like, was there any desire to listen to us, you know? So we were figuring that out, but we were also kind of both coming to terms with our relationship to our heritage, just on it for ourselves, you know, like how did we want to, what role would this play in our lives as artists, in our musical lives, you know? So I guess like I would say that the whole path for me was one of creative inquiry into those questions. You know, particularly like for me in an African American art form, what do I have to offer? What is my role? What are my responsibilities? You know, what is my you could say the ethical questions of who am I doing this for and with, and what is it about? You know, so those questions were very, and still are, very important to me. And then the other thing was that living in California as a person of Indian descent, kind of had to deal with a lot of exoticism, you know, like people would just like, I remember I would get these, so this is when we had answering machines, right? So in the 90s, phone messages out of the blue from people who just like read about me and wanted, you know, it would be like, they'd even like, I remember once I got this message that said, "Hello, my name is Mindya Devi, and I'm very interested in hearing more about this Indian American jazz musician. I'm very curious to know what he's doing with Indian music and jazz." And then like I found out that actually her name wasn't Mindya Devi, her name was Mindy Klein. And she was, you know, just a European American who kind of wanted to, I don't know. So she like misrepresented herself, and also had this kind of weird fetishistic interest in what I was doing. It wasn't so like that was the dynamic, you know, like, and so I wanted to, I didn't want to self-exoticize. So I wasn't so concerned with like making my music sound Indian or prove my Indianness, you know.
Sure.
What I wanted to do was like internalize some of these concepts in a way that was creatively empowering for myself without like wearing it on my sleeve as like as some kind of evidence that I belong in one place versus another place, you know.
Yes.
I felt like there were too many complicated questions so I wanted to be subtle about it, you know.
Yeah. But ultimately those questions have led you to redefine and redefine yourself.
Yes.
With those little struggles, made you find your own path and just own it, I guess.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, I owned all of it in the sense that I stand behind every artistic choice I made, you know.
Yeah.
And particularly that kind of like initial stance of resisting that kind of exotic gaze, you know. But what I also, I wasn't concerned with sounding Indian to anyone except to an Indian musician. And I found that Indian musicians heard, like you've heard, like they heard the Carnatic rhythmic content in a way that they could kind of connect to and be like, oh, I can play with that, And my goal was basically like, well, can I play with Indian musicians? I don't, not to prove anything to anybody, but just so that I can build community with them, and like be in the world and collaborate and make something new, So,
But I guess that meant that you needed to study
exactly.
further the music, because you don't
Yes.
just wake one morning and then you can play Carnatic
Right,
music.
right. But the other thing is that, as Zakir Hussain has proved magnificently, and this is something I tried to talk to him about in that interview you mentioned, he learned to play with other people too. So it was a two-way street, which is to me like the key thing, because often like I said, sometimes these traditions are treated as fixed and kind of impervious. But what I hear in someone like Zakir, or also in, who you should have on here is Rajna Swaminathan. I don't know if you know who she is,
yes,
but
I know the
she's a
name. Yes.
fantastic artist, very versatile and very creative. Trained as a mridangam player, trained on mridangam with Mayalpuram Shivaram since she was a little kid, and is now composing and creating her own music and has collaborated with all kinds of people. And I've played with her for years. She's really incredible, really. But so like that kind of versatility of like being willing to play with Afro-Cuban musicians or with a drummer like Tyshawn Sori or Marcus Gilmore, or Damian Reed or somebody, and that's basically what has been happening with these folks.
Yeah.
Like Zakir kind of, when we were at Banff that year, where when he came to Banff in 2015, I believe it was, and for the program that I direct there every summer, except this summer, he was there for a week. It was incredible to have him among us. It was like one of the greatest moments of that whole program, I would say, in the history of that program. But we did a little impromptu session with him and me and this Cuban musician named Yosvani Terry, who's now a colleague and collaborator of mine at Harvard as well. But it was with a couple of other vocalists too. And Yosvani is, he's Afro-Cuban and he's like deeply versed in the sacred traditions of that community. So he could do he would sing these chants for the Orishas, which had these like different bata rhythms associated with them and stuff. So he started singing one of these, this song for Elegua. And Zakir started playing the bata rhythms on tabla.
Oh,
I mean,
incredible,
he knew the stuff from when he hung out with Armando Perazza in the 70s, And it sounded real. Like it actually sounded like bata. I was like, what's going on here, So that kind of commitment, which it has to go both ways. Like, not only just that you are some master of some tradition that's fixed and in the past, in like a fishbowl or something, but rather that it's continuing to grow and expand and evolve because of figures like him or like Rajna, that because they keep learning and absorbing and changing, and then bringing that back into the classical form. So that's kind of what I have come to appreciate. And I noticed that your series is called Masters or something. It has the word masters in it. And I'm not sure if I qualify, but I mean, I do think often of what Zakir Hussain said that day, which is that week, which is something that he learned from his father, which is that you can never be a master at anything. You can only be an eternal student. That's the most important advice I've ever heard from anybody.
Yeah. You know, one other thing that was really struck me that he said in that particular interview is about rhythmic exploration versus exploration of sound. And I think he referred to it like when he said, when he was speaking about sound, the spirit of the instrument. And actually, I wanted to ask you about that. How you see yourself in that, you know, duality. So, you know, I know that, you know, from listening to your music, you do have, there's a lot of rhythm there. And obviously, being studying South Indian rhythm, I could, as you said, I could identify a few of the rhythmic concepts that I know. Um, so there's a lot of rhythm there. But on the other side, there is the exploration of the sound on the instrument. How do you find yourself in that duality? Do you feel that there is either or there is a place for all of it to come together? Where do you see yourself in that balance?
Uh, that's well put. You know, everything we do is rhythm. Um, when we think of sound and time, that means that there's rhythmic content in it. It might not be cyclical, or it might not always be measured in a mathematical sense, but it always has some kind of rhythmic quality we that marks it as human. You know, even speeches like this. I mean, especially, you know, it's made of rhythms that we can produce and that we can hear, right? And that means that they're human rhythms. Same with the heartbeat and with everything that our hands can do and that our limbs can do, and that our lungs can do, that the breath does. That's another cycle, you know. And you know, basically, what's the idea of rhythm being expressed through sound means that we entrain through listening. You know, it means that um, we access it through that channel, right? Um, so I guess I never really think of them as particularly separate. There is a whole universe of expression on the piano, for example, that I kind of came to late, I would say. You know, I'm a late bloomer. All of it. I'm hoping still to bloom much further in the decades to come. but you know, I didn't embrace even the idea of making my life in music until I was 23. So then, I mean, I'd been making music in different ways since I was 3, but it was 23 when I made that, like, oh, this is who I am kind of moment, and that turn, you know, and what that. So then I was like, oh God, I have so much catching up to do now, you know, um, and particularly because the piano was this kind of instrument I came to on my own terms and with no guidance, no one telling me kind of you should do this, you shouldn't do that, which made it this like space of enjoyment and exploratory discovery and possibility. But it also meant that you know, I had to figure a lot of things out for myself, uh, and that takes time. And in particular, like, I mean, I have a pretty nice piano, but it's old and kind of beat up, and doesn't have a lot of depth with sonic possibilities. And I remember when I was not even very long ago, like I'd say 10 years ago, I was doing an extensive solo tour, um, just playing solo piano concerts night after night for like weeks on end, you know. And in Europe, I got to encounter like some of the best pianos I've ever played, you know. And when by best, I mean the deepest possibilities for expression in ways that were like revealed to me as I was playing, you know, in concert. And in fact, there's a somewhere in the out there in the the web universe. There's a concert of me playing it in Bonn. It's just audio. It was recorded for radio in Bonn, Germany, at the Beethoven House, which is where they house the Beethoven's archives. And that piano there is really other people have commented on it. I think Jason Moran posted about it recently, about that piano in particular, what it has to offer. And so I remember while I was playing that I was like learning or discovering like, oh, a piano can do this, you know. So I'd say like over the last 10 years in particular, I've been really attentive to that, much more to being expressive with sound and with touch and the subtleties of that. I mean, when I listen back to my recordings from the 90s, I mean, it was there, you know, like it wasn't like I had no awareness of it. It's just that it was more intuitive, you know. And now being kind of like knowing that timbre can be manipulated and you know, and in a way that's like meaningful, you know, that's expressed. So I think of like especially like making records for ECM over the last 6 years with Manfred. I was thinking about this because he like really responds to that, you know. And there's this, we were mixing the sextet album, Far From Over, which came out in 2017. I remember that mixing session earlier, like in the spring of that year, where he's like, you know, we have to feature this where you make that sound that's like gong 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 on the piano. he's like imitating it vocally, and it's like, to me, I was just playing a D, but it was actually like there was something about the quality of it that I was like kind of allowing the timbre to evolve as I played it, you know.
Yeah.
But that can then like carry the listener somewhere. So like basically this awareness that sound can evolve in the ear in a way that gives the music direction. You know,
Yes.
I guess that kind of the awareness that's kind of slowly dawned on me as I'm 48 years old, so it took me a while. but yeah, that kind of it means you can be subtle, you can be you can find a lot in the quiet register, you know. There's this whole universe of expression down there, you know, that and I think like when we play with drummers, and particularly snare, you know, people with kit, the whole kit with the snare, where you like when you're comping, you're kind of sparring with the snare drum, you know. And also like that ride cymbal kind of creates this haze over the top end of the spectrum. But sort of like finding space for that even inside of that. I think like the trio album Break Stuff has a lot of timbral expression. I think it was partly because, you know, Marcus Gilmore is very awake to that, and Stefan Crump is very awake to that. So like we kind of, and we had time and space to really cultivate it.
Yeah. Vijay, I wanted to maybe go back to your learning about Konnakol and about South Indian rhythm and so on. Could you share with the audience how you studied this rhythmic art or rhythmic ideas and rhythmic concepts? And did you have, I know that most of what you were telling here is that you've been learning and acquiring everything on your own just by listening and trying to figure out how it works. But do you have any guidance, or if not, did you have any particular way of studying this rhythmic tradition and rhythmic concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I remember that, well, in the I went to India a number of times when I was young, but I also remember going in 1995, and that was around the time. By then, I'd kind of like made this turn. You know, it was in '94 that I decided that I was going to be an artist, right? So going that year was really pivotal for me. We went to a lot of concerts. I think it was around December season in Chennai. So we
the big festival, yes.
Yes, of course. So I saw a lot of music. Got a lot of books on music, particularly on Carnatic music. um, met with various musicians and stuff, and um, and then I also like uh, got my hands on a book that Trichy Shankaran published. He self-published it.
The art of Konnakol, yes.
It's called The Art of South Indian Drumming, actually. So it's like it might be an earlier, but it's not specific. I mean, it's got some Konnakol in it. It's got some things about the drum itself, about mridangam. Yeah, so like that, I kind of devoured that whole thing, um, and even corresponded with him a bit. And then like Rudresh and I um, had this commission from Chicago Cultural Center. So at the time he was still living in Chicago, and so or he had been living in Chicago. He moved to New York in '97, and I moved in '98. But we did this thing in '99 that was a collaboration with Trichy Shankaran. We kind of somehow worked it out. That was we called it Monodharma Trio, which means like improvisation trio, and so we got together with him. I remember like we were so nervous going to his house. Like I remember Rudresh was driving and we almost got in a car accident because he was so like preoccupied, like, oh my God, am I going to be able to measure up to this cat? He's like one of the greatest in the world. That was so funny. I mean, not funny at the time, but he was like, we really almost died. And then he pulled over and he had a cigarette. He's like, I need to cool out. We're going to be a little late. It's okay. So, but then, Shankaran was so warm and kind to us and so inviting. And we had such a lovely time with him. And in fact, that piece called Configurations, that's on my album Panoptic Modes, was actually written for that group. We first did it together because I basically wanted to feature some things that were like of his world, but it wasn't trying to be like in a raga. It was really just trying to deal with some of these moras and corvais and those kinds of things. So that he sounded fantastic on, of course, and it was really just beautiful playing with him. He had such a sensitivity to talk about sound. He had a really nice feel. The groove was deep and the sound was so rich,
Yeah.
So we had some beautiful times doing that. We played probably half dozen concerts in that format. Yeah, I need to find those. They're probably on DAT somewhere. I have to get a DAT player. Yeah, so that was like kind of the first, in a way, that was like validation. It's like, okay, this can work. And beyond that, the sound of the piano with hand percussion, which like I'd kind of awoken to from hearing Randy Weston's trio, African Rhythms Trio, in the mid '90s. I mean, first, like the kind of the tactile quality of it, like that everything is done with, when everything is done with the hands, then there's this kind of like intimacy to it that's really
it's quite
sweet.
Organic. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And then the fact that like for what this was for Mr. Weston was like an exploration into his past and his heritage and his, something ancient. And that whole, everything about it was so significant to me. And that was actually part of why I had that idea to put that trio together, to like basically piano and mridangam as a unit, And some of that then, actually the piece Tirtha was written originally for that group too, for Monodharma Trio. Piece that then became the name of the band and the album. Yeah, from later in 2011. So
it sounds like it was quite an influential meeting.
Yeah. And then the other thing was that in the year 2000, Steve Coleman and I went to India for a month and hung out with the Mayalpuram Shivaraman.
Oh wow! Okay, that's another whole world of rhythm there.
Yeah, and they knew each other they kind of would sort of, they respected each other, but they would also kind of talk shit about each other every now and then in a way that I think musicians just do. That's just like musicians across the planet do that, right? So, um, but it was, it was actually great to just deal with another elder who had just as deep a perspective, a bit different, quite
Yes,
different,
quite different.
much more about the mathematics of it, but also there was this beauty in it. And I guess I could kind of relate to that. I mean, having studied math and physics in college and for a little bit in graduate school, which like they're just basically like that there's an aesthetics to it, that it's not just cold and hard, that it's actually, it has its own kind of elegance and beauty, that there could be, basically like for him, for Shukaraman, it was sort of about finding these solutions that had this like magical kind of like, I don't know, sparkle to them, or some sort of like discover, like the kind of like thrill of discovery, and also like what it felt like, the I was actually just thinking of one. I mean, like these shifts that I talked about that I experienced as a kid. Like I remember there was one that he taught us, or he didn't even teach us. He just sort of did it for us, and I just like. And then I was like, "Let me write that down." He's like, "No, just listen." But it was like this thing where it was in seven, but he would keep moving the speeds to subdivide the three and across the three and the four. I don't even know if I can do these syllables because they're so fast, but it was probably about how they would shift. The speed, shifting speeds was what it was. So it was like, if this is right in seven, 1, 2, 3, 4. Nam kita takateri kita taka 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 dan godin natam dan godin natam nam kita takateri kita taka 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 nam kita takateri taka dan godin natam dan godin natam. Nam kita takateri kita kata nam kita takateri kita taka dan godin natam. Non kita takateri kita taka non kita takateri kita taka non kita takateri kita taka don godin natam don godin. Wait, now I'm losing track. There's something about the number. So it's partly like the way these things shift, the speeds.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I did the wrong number of them, but because this is 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It was a year or two. But it was like the way it ends is like this. Nam kita takateri kita taka nam kita takateri kita taka don godin natam godin. Don godin nut don godin. Don godin nut don godin. Like that,
The beautiful
so that
mora, yes.
Yeah. It's like, it actually has this like roundness to it because it keeps kind of
expanding
and contracting, and it's very like just this you can write it out, like you can count it out, you can it's clear what how the different subdivisions are, but the way it he had this way of like finding that sweet spot where it was like both, as he would say, calculative. That was his word that I think he made up. But also had this beauty to it, this kind of elegance. That
one of the things. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I, in my study encountered is that, sometimes when you come up, as a student of this kind of rhythm, I would sometimes come up with my own compositions and stuff, and it's and even if the calculation itself is good, is sound, it doesn't mean that the composition will be appreciated, because it's not enough just to have the mathematics. It has to have some beauty in it, and math together.
Yeah, so I think like that kind of awareness of how things could influence the feeling, that it wasn't just math for its own sake or kind of like complexity for its own sake, but that it would actually have this effect on the body in a way. on us as listeners, as that, like that it would kind of shake us or sort of move us in a way that was
Yeah.
like meaningful.
Yes.
That to me was that's probably the most important thing I learned from spending time with him. Then the thing was like as I got to know him more, he would come to the U.S. and he had a disciple in Baltimore named Swaminathan, who would host him to come visit. And Swaminathan has these two daughters, Rajna and Anjana, who were both they were at the time little kids. They were 8 and 4 or something like that. They were 8 and I don't know, something like that when I came across them first. And Rajna was playing mridangam and piano, and Anjana was playing violin, Carnatic violin, and they were both singing and learning dance and all these things. So they were kind of they had been studying with him over, through online means, and this was in the early 2000s, so it was pretty early, But they would also like arrange for trips, and he would visit or they would visit. And Swaminathan himself was also had studied for a long time and would teach them. And so then, like as they came of age, as they grew, now they're in their mid-late 20s, they became really important artists in their own right, who had grown up with this stuff, but also grown up in the U.S., with access to everything else. And so, like, like I said, you should interview either or both of them, particularly Rajna, because she has that perspective, having studied with him, with Shivaraman for so long, and then also having developed, because like one thing I learned from him is that it's a creative tradition. It's not this fixed thing that you just learn these rhythms from your teacher and then you teach them to your student. It's not just that. It's actually like you're given the tools to make something new, and it's about discovery. So,
and it's amazing how when you study some of the basic mechanism and math and geometry of the rhythm, after you discover that, the more you practice this, the more you realize how many variations are possible, and also embellishments and maybe find different calculations and stuff like that.
yes, yeah. So, for a while I was working a lot with these things. Like, I would say that it was, in some way, all of this has been an ingredient in almost every piece of music I've ever written since my first album, which came out in 1995, so 25 years worth of the stuff. But I also like, I wasn't striving to just dazzle people with mastery. Like I wanted it to be meaningful and to have emotional value, and I wanted it to mean something to people, But I think maybe just that kind of attunement to rhythm and that sort of focus on it as a compositional space was and continues to be very important to me.
Yes, well, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing these insights and experiences, which I have came across quite a few of your interviews, and so it's nice for you to share these things that I have not heard you share before about your experience with that study in music and tradition. So Vijay, it's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to having you on the show. I really appreciate your time, and I hope, or maybe before we end the interview, maybe you could tell the listeners and the viewers what you have been doing in the last 7 weeks since this unprecedented lockdown situation been. I'm sure you've got lots of stuff on the pipeline and waiting to be made.
I guess I've been one thing I've been doing is going through the vaults. Like I've done some live streams and things, but I find that They don't sound that good. They sound okay, but I care about what things sound like, as someone who's been in the art of making records for 25 years, sound is very important.
Yes.
And just like creating a space for somebody, and making an experience that's enveloping and that feels human and real and alive, So the studio art is very important to me. So right now, well, actually today, I released something that was made 17 years ago.
Oh, wow. A recording that you've done that was never released
Yes,
before.
it was actually, it was a project I did with a poet named Mike Ladd called In What Language. And at the time, I mean, I was dealing with all these ingredients we've been talking about, but I kind of would subsume them into these larger, like I would often make, I would use the idea of a tihai or a morda or a korvai in slow motion, kind of, or in a cyclical way to kind of make forms that had those kinds of structure to them. So rather than like make it this rhythm that would dazzle you, it would actually be kind of in the bones of the piece, So when I listen back to the music, particularly from that time, from the early 2000s, it's very full of this stuff. So this stuff is an example. So I decided to release just the instrumental versions of the same album, essentially. It's an album that when it came out, a lot of the focus was on what it was about, which was very important because it was about the post 9/11 moment, and particularly for people of color in the West. But there was something about the music that I thought was worth revisiting, particularly because then, like, once you mute the vocals, you have these kind of blank spaces that are just very vibrant, and there's a lot of rhythm in it, So that's just out now on Bandcamp. If you just look, it's called In What Strumentals. It's like because the original thing was called In What Language, so we called it In What Strumentals. Instrumentals from In What Language. The other thing is that I made a trio album with Tyshawn and Linda O. We recorded in December, and so I'm finding a way to mix it remotely, little by little.
Do you have a little studio at home, or you have?
Well, I'm not doing. I mean, I'm working with an engineer who has a much better studio at home, and so his name is David Torn, and this is for ECM. So we're working on it little by little. Hopefully that'll be out in the winter, and hopefully we'll be able to be out in the world to play concerts. And then I have some different composition commissions. One is for a solo pianist, classical pianist. One is for a cello concerto. One is a piece for string quartet and clarinet. So, and again, like these same ingredients find their way into everything I do. It may not always be obvious to somebody, but I think it'd probably be apparent to you.
Okay.
And probably to your listeners and viewers too.
Yeah.
So really all these albums that I've been making over this quarter century, like they all contain that stamp or that same kind of rhythmic intrigue. And again, like I don't think of it as complexity so much as sort of like something that gives us something to work with,
Yeah, so a framework or like a architecture in rhythm.
Exactly. Yeah, and particularly, I guess, like I wanted to bring together those sensibilities, like the polyphony of West African music and African American music, with these kind of additive techniques that you find in Carnatic and Hindustani music.
Yeah.
So that creates like a certain there's layers. Basically, we can layer these things and then create whole rhythmic systems that have a cyclicality, but also have this like richness.
Beautiful. I really look forward to hearing when it's out. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vijay. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.